hours this morning, and he's on duty tonight as well. So he's worshiping kind of closer to where he's staying down in Norfolk area. That's where he is. And of course, Lily is out with pink eye, both eyes, and so Jason's watching her this morning. Our topic for today is courage. And frankly, I wrote the lesson and then scrapped it all, and then rewrote it, and then scrapped it again, and then rewrote it, and then scrapped that one as well. Because there's just so much to talk about, and that we're just simply not going to get to talk about this morning on the topic of courage. And the reason I had scrapped the previous three is because they just had way too much information that wasn't really pertinent to the points that I want to make. And so, Laurel, it's okay, I will not run over an hour. I got that out of my system a few weeks ago. And we will not be talking about everything to do with courage, but making just two simple points this morning. I asked everyone else to open to Joshua, and I'm still in Judges. Joshua chapter 1. Joshua has been told repeatedly here in verse 6 and verse 7, be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to your fathers to give them. But only be strong and courageous, and be careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant had commanded you. And again, here again in verse 9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. And then Joshua repeats this back to the people in verse 19, or verse 18. At the very end, the last words of chapter 1, only be strong and courageous. And when you think about the passages that command us to be strong and courageous, or at least to be courageous, they almost always happen in the Old Testament. Those are generally where that word appears. But if you turn with me to Revelation chapter 21, we realize that the command to be courageous is not something that is just an Old Testament principle or something that was only for the nation of Israel. Look here how he states it in kind of in the negative sense in verse 8. Revelation chapter 21 there in verse 8. He says, but as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their position will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. You think of the list of that's going to consume the lake that burns with sulfur and fire in the second death. It's going to be just a huge list of terrible things. And he has some pretty big sins, if you ever want to classify it as that, of murder and sorcery and idolatry. He also throws in liars, all liars. And there in the very first one in verse 8 is the cowardly. When we think of cowardice as not so much of a sin of commission, but maybe of a slight sin of omission. I mean, that's not really that big of a deal, and yet he begins this list in verse 8 with the cowardly. Now, the one story we want to kind of focus in on is over in Luke chapter 22. You can find this account in all four Gospels. It is slightly unusual to find all of the same accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and yet this account here in Luke 22 you can find in all four of those. And it's one of those things that is so imperative to understanding the character of people that is placed in every single one. So here in Luke 22, starting there in verse 31, Jesus at the Last Supper talks directly to Peter. He says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demands to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I pray that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. And Jesus says, I tell you, Peter, that the rooster will not crow this day until you deny that you know me 3 times. He's telling Peter here that his courage is going to fail him. That he's going to act cowardice for at least a time. And Peter, obviously, here is not okay with that statement. I am ready to go to prison or even to die with you. And this happens again, like I said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record the same thing. And if you think from Peter's standpoint, Peter has a lot of great successes in his past. A couple pages earlier in Matthew chapter 14, where after Jesus has fed the 5,000, and he has gone up the mountain, the disciples get in the boat and begin to cross, in the middle of the night, the Sea of Tiberias. And there, in the middle of the sea, a storm arises, and they see Jesus. You can almost imagine him, his silhouette being lit up with the flashing of lightning. And instead of just simply being pleased to see Jesus walking on water and coming into the boat, here in Matthew chapter 14, down around verses 25 and following, Peter here in verse 28 says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." That wouldn't have even entered my mind, let alone had the courage to ask. If it's really you, command me to walk on water, as if that's a possibility that would be this naturally in your mind. And yet, Peter, out of all the 12, that was his inclination, to have the courage to walk on water. Now, we oftentimes kind of criticize him a little bit as we get a couple verses down. Here in verse 30, when he saw the wind and was afraid, and he began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took a hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" Wouldn't Peter still feel like he had insurmountable faith to some degree to ask Jesus to allow him to walk on water? And even if he did look for a time away and got a little afraid, wouldn't you feel slightly indignant? Well, I'm not one of little faith. Out of all of the people in this world, I'm one of the 12 on this boat. And out of the 12 on this boat, I'm the one who left the boat to join you in a storm on the water. Yeah, Jesus is demanding more courage and more faith from him. John chapter 6, another one of Peter's great successes. This is a parallel account with Matthew chapter 14, where Jesus has fed the 5,000. This is right before he walks on water, right afterwards. The next day, Jesus gets into this big discord over him being the bread of life. And then gets rather graphic down around verses 52, and everyone says that this is a hard saying. And his disciples here in verse 60, when many disciples heard it, they said, "This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it?" And then here in verse 66, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. And that this particular teaching here in John chapter 6 was so hard that the entire crowd of the 5,000 men left. And Jesus has also been traveling around with another large group of people that are not numbered among the 5,000, and they left. And so Jesus turns here in verse 67, and he says to the 12, "Do you want to go away as well?" And Peter, being Peter, is the one who answers in verse 68, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And we have believed, and we have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Again, Peter has the courage to say, "I don't understand fully what you're teaching or what it means yet, but I'm going to stick around knowing that you are the only one that has the words of eternal life." And back over to Matthew chapter 16. The question comes up here in verse 13. "Who do people say that I am?" And so they answer, well, some say that you are John the Baptist, and others Elijah. Some say that you're Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. And Jesus turns to them and says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And again, Peter, being Peter, is the one who answered. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven." And he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Again, Peter stands out from among the crowd, even the crowd of the most devout, as being one who understands and is courageous enough to take a stance for these things. He has a lot of successes. So when we go over to John chapter 18 and we read of his denial, it's a shocking story. And I think it's shocking to him that he's in that position. And it should be shocking to us as the audience to think of Peter, one of the 12 who's named by name, time after time after time, of doing great things, to be the one who makes this statement. And so here in John chapter 18, there in verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did the other disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the high court, or the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door, and so did the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? And he says, I am not. And the servant and the officials had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Now if we jump down again to verse 25, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. And so they said to him, You also are not one of his disciples, are you? And he denied it and said, I am not. And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him? And again he denied it. And at once the rooster crowed. 3 times he had the opportunity to have the courage to simply say, I'm with them. So the question comes up, why did Peter deny? After all of his past successes, after all that he had seen and done, was it that Peter just simply did not believe his own words? Back when he testified earlier at the Last Supper, I'm willing to die with you? Was it that Peter was being false just a few hours earlier? I don't think so. Was it that Peter perhaps did not believe that Jesus would ever be arrested? In Luke chapter 4, it's a really neat, if you look at the beginning of chapter 4 and at the end of chapter 4, Jesus is brought up to the pinnacle of the temple and told by Satan to cast yourself off, and then Satan quotes the scripture that the Lord will command his angels concerning you to guard you, lest you dash your foot against a stone. And Jesus does not take him up on this offer. He then goes to his own hometown and he reads a scroll from Isaiah. And he says, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And he hands the scroll back and he goes and sits down. And the crowd gets so outraged that he has taken this upon himself that they grab him and they rush him out to the pinnacle, not of the temple this time, but the pinnacle of his own hometown. And they're going to cast him off. And notice what it says in verse 30. But just passing through their midst, he went away. Doesn't really describe how that is, but you could imagine in any number of ways that here is this huge crowd who have physically grabbed him and hauled him to the top of this hill. And then he just walks right through their midst. It happens again in John chapter 8, where he is in the temple in John chapter 8, where he will be this Wednesday. And the crowd is stirred up in verse 59. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out from the temple. It's one of those things that there's not a lot said about it, and we don't really think about it that much whenever we go through John, but he hid himself inside of a public space in a large group of people and then just left. It happens again in John chapter 10 and verse 39. It says here at the end of chapter 10, again they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. Peter has witnessed on numerous occasions at this point in time of Jesus actively them trying to kill him or to arrest him or to stone him, and then him just vanishing. And so the idea of Jesus saying, well, I'm going to be arrested, didn't seem to click with him, because in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus flat out tells them that this is the case. We had looked at verses 13 down through verse 20, and in verse 21, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and then be killed, and on the third day be raised. Peter, again, as is Peter's habit, in verse 22, took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. I think of all the scenarios of what Peter expected, this gives us the clearest indication that Peter just never truly believed that this would happen. Jesus rebukes him, and tells him to get behind me, Satan, you are a hindrance. But it doesn't seem to maybe ever click fully with Peter. And I would suggest, as you look at Peter's story, that his expectations of the reality of the future did not meet up with what really happened. And whenever that happens, there is some dissonance that happens in our minds, and we have to figure out how we handle that. There's a really neat connection in Joshua chapter 2. Since we had started there, we'll look there just a moment. After commanding his people to be strong and courageous, and again in verse 7 to be strong and courageous, and again in verse 9 to be strong and courageous, and Joshua turning to the people and telling them to be strong and courageous, in chapter 2 we get to see the people as they cross over the Jordan and they camp right outside of Jericho. It says in verse 11 that the Canaanites' hearts melted within them, that they had just lost all courage. And that phrase doesn't happen very often. It happens again here in Joshua. It happens in chapter 7. Chapter 6, they went up against Jericho and soundly defeated them. They were so exuberant over their win at Jericho that they immediately rush in to fight against Ai in chapter 7. And what you have is you have a people who were told to go against Joshua or Jericho, and were not commanded directly yet to go against Ai, but in their courage and in their exuberance, in chapter 7, they rush in, and it says here in verse 5 that the men of Ai killed about 36 men and chased them before the gates as far as Shebron, and struck them down in their descent, and their hearts of the people melted and became as water. It's the same phrase back in chapter 2 as it is in chapter 7. That their expectations of what God was going to do for them, when that expectation was shattered, they lost their courage. And here's the connection I want to make between both of those, is that Peter had expectations of what the future was going to hold for him, and what was going to hold for Jesus. And when the expectation was shattered, he lost all of his courage. Here, Joshua and his people, when they had an expectation of what was going to happen, they had all the courage in the world. They were willing to go in and fight a battle again immediately because the last one went so well. But as soon as the smallest thing changed in their expectations, their hearts melted. And the question comes up for us, when do we usually have our courage fail? I would suggest it usually is when our vision for the future is shattered. Now, what we usually do, and I think this is kind of common human nature, is we project our expectations for the future. And then we begin to prep and to plan for it. I expect in the next few months that we're going to have this happen and this happen and this happen. And so we're going to get all of that lined up. I expect, my parents are going to arrive this weekend, so we're going to clean the house, we're going to stock the cupboards full, we're going to clean the sheets for the first time ever. I'm just kidding. But we're going to have all those preparations there. And we expect that, we may face some hardships. And we prep ourselves for that mentally. But what happens when a different hardship arises? Or what happens whenever we meet a hardship that is way harder than we expected? Or something just completely out of the blue happens? When we project the possible future and we prep ourselves for this, and it doesn't happen, oftentimes we face challenges and we feel completely unprepared and ill-equipped and then just hopeless. And it's the idea of, I don't know what to do at this point. I was prepared for this, and now this has happened, and I was ready for this, and I could have handled this one, but I can't handle that. I don't know what Peter was expecting. In the garden, Peter was completely ready to draw his sword and fight to the death. But to stand and watch Jesus have a kangaroo trial and to be lumped in with him was not a part of Peter's plan. And that ruined his courage. And that oftentimes happens for us. We're courageous, we're ready for this, and as soon as something different happens, we lose all of that courage because we feel ill-equipped, and we feel helpless, and we feel unprepared. And if we can't see a way to map through our future, we become oftentimes discouraged. So just two simple points. James chapter 4. We looked at this one last week, but James chapter 4, the first thing I would suggest is allow for the future to change. If we hold on to what we believe the future is going to hold, so much so that that is the only reasonable expectation of the future that we conceive of, then we're always going to be thrown off-footed. And in James chapter 4, he says here, for those who are projecting that future forward, here at verse 13, come now, you who say tomorrow or today we will go into such and such a town, and we'll spend a year there and trade and make a profit. There's their expectation of the future. We're going to do this. And they're prepared for that set of scenarios. But he reminds them in verse 14, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. For what is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. We need to have an expectation that the future is not always what we're going to be prepared for. I think that human nature and the Bible clearly states that we are to be prepared for what we can be prepared for. That we arrange ahead of time on Sunday to be here as best as we can. As a provider for the household, it's my job to prepare for the future as much as I can financially. To make sure that I'm prepared to go to work the next day. You're prepared to do X, Y, or Z. All these things we are to prep and prepare for, but understanding that as much as we prep and prepare for the future, we don't know what the future is going to hold. And not to cling on to what we believe might happen. And yet, oddly enough, as much as we end up with this set of scenarios where we plan and we prep for a future that never comes, next time we prep and prepare, it seems to be that we always kind of delude ourselves and think, well, it's going to be exactly like we planned it this time. Last time it didn't work out, but this time is going to work. And James is encouraging us to have God in our future. That something's going to be different than we expect. And when that something different happens, that we're okay with it. Understanding if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. And if he doesn't, that we'll be okay with it. Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3. We'll look at verses 5 and verse 6. The second quick point is to lean not on ourselves for the future struggles, but to lean on God for those future struggles. Meaning that if I feel ill-prepared for whatever is lying ahead of me, or if I feel ill-equipped for whatever is going to happen, or if I feel like I cannot handle whatever is now my current present situation, that's when I lose courage. But my courage should not be in me. Peter's courage was in his sword in the garden. No longer had his sword. He was standing inside of the enemy's barracks, so to speak, and he didn't have courage in God. And that's the point. As we look here in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and verse 6, it says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. Simply stated, whenever the future comes, whenever, as it will, and things aren't exactly as we planned, which it won't be, to not feel ill-prepared in yourself and lose the courage because you don't think you can handle this or that, but to trust the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Now we're going to turn to a passage we don't often turn to, Lamentation 3. Lamentations 3. There in verses 19 down through verse 26. Lamentation 3, 19 through 26. Here, as we are reading the lament over the fall of Israel and the downfall of Jerusalem, whenever their expectations were shattered for what their future was going to be for their nation. There in verse 19 he says, remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, and great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. And the Lord is good to those who wait for him, and the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Lamentations is a powerful book. It's a short one, but a powerful one. And what he says here is whenever they're looking at the destruction of their nation and their people, and their expectations of the future is not at all what they want, and they can't see their way out, when their courage is beginning to fail, he reminds them that this is what he remembers. He says here in verse 21, I call this to mind, meaning that we're going to forget it. We're going to look at it and we're going, that's the truth. That's what I need to remember. And then we're going to look at the waves around us, and we're going to forget that Jesus stands right before us. We forget that we're currently walking on water, doing the impossible, because God is beside us. And we look at the world around us and, I need to call this to mind. And therefore have hope that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, that his mercies never come to an end, and they are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. All the glory that comes forth in a sunrise should remind us of God's never ceasing, every new mercy. And even if we don't know how the day is going to end, if it begins with God and his mercy and his everlasting love, that we should have courage not in ourselves and our own ability, but to lean on God. And so the courage that he speaks there in Joshua chapter 1, to be strong and courageous, is not to mean that you as an individual are so powerful and so mighty that you can overcome any obstacle. In fact, that's the exact opposite of the story of Joshua. The story of Joshua has nothing to do with the nation of Israel and their strength and their ability. It has everything to do with them following God and them having courage in him. The same thing happens with Peter. He is a very courageous person, but oftentimes puts his courage in himself rather than in God. And oftentimes we do the same. That our courage can completely and utterly fail us, because if it's based on something as weak and as flimsy as us, of course it's going to fail us. But if we trust in God, who can do everything to his good pleasure, then what is there to fear? Dennis has picked out number 830 for us to sing. Whenever we begin to doubt God, all kinds of troubles arise in our lives. We begin to fear things that we shouldn't fear, or we begin to trust in things that are not God. When we do that, our life gets thrown off the straight path that God has prepared for us. Oftentimes fear of other things or a lack of courage leads us to sin in rather heinous ways. And if that's been the case, if we can help you to have more courage in God and to come back to him, let us know as we stand to sing number 830. Why did Jesus wait?